Hello, good evening, and many thanks for joining us yet again for another edition of Moomin Tonight. My name is Moomin, and I welcome you. Tonight, we take a look at maritime piracy, and we focus on assessing it and whether or not it's a threat to global security and the global economy. And tonight, we have been joined by an expert. I'll introduce him shortly, but you know that the rise in maritime piracy is not only posing a security threat to countries across the globe, but is also affecting the more than 80% of global trade, which depends on maritime transportation. Now, the frequency and cruelty of attacks and hijacking of ships and kidnapping and killing of seafarers is unprecedented in the past 3 years. Now, piracy has become, quote-unquote, a lucrative venture by some unscrupulous persons in the Horn of Africa. And here in Ghana, we have not been spared, as it has also had its share of the piracy attack. And I'm referring to our own country. Now, on tonight's Moment Tonight, Dr. Kamal Deen, and Ali Kamal Deen, he's an authority in international maritime law. He would help us have an insight into security and economic implications of the acts of piracy. Dr. Ali Kamal is an international maritime law expert. He is also Director of Research and lecturer at the Ghana Armed Forces Staff College. Doc, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We're indeed glad and honored to have you here on this platform.
And thank you for hosting me on this all-important topic.
Right, Doc. You know, for many of us who are not experts in this area, when we hear of piracy, the first thing that comes to mind is what we see in the films, the movies. That's one-eyed man with sometimes a gun or a sword, you know, and then all of a sudden it appears it's coming closer home. It's becoming real for many of us, but we still do not understand what it is. What is maritime piracy?
Yeah, let me say that your indication and perception of piracy is very right. What we see in the movies may be an exaggeration of what it is in reality, but it is still the same kind of violent conduct, and people that are perpetrating piracy will normally dress in such a way and behave in such a way that you can see the violence right in their faces and in their action. Talking about the definition and the nature of piracy, piracy can be variously defined because each country may define piracy the way you want, but there is a common international law definition of piracy. And this international law definition of piracy has evolved as a rule of customary international law, because since you refer to the movies, that will tell you that there's a historical narrative when it comes to piracy. And because of that historical narrative, this is not the first time that the international community is confronted with piracy. So there has been an evolution of a definition of piracy from customary international law. And this is now reflected or codified in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is much more like a global charter that was adopted in 1982, and it provides broad spectrum of governance tools for the maritime space and oceans. And as part of that, it defines the offense of piracy. That is a very strict legal definition, and we can go through the items of that definition, or what I will call the elements of that definition.
Now, I'll be glad if you do, but do I understand piracy to be just stealing from a ship, for instance, or it goes beyond that?
I think that is very fundamental to the definition of piracy, and that word is something that you find, or that connotation is something that you find in the very opening of the definition of piracy in the Law of the Sea Convention. But broadly speaking, you are talking about any acts of violence, detention, acts of depredation, which is what you are referring to, trying to steal property on board a ship, and that is committed by persons on board another ship, and that is committed for purposes of private gains in the high seas. So if you look at the definition carefully, you are talking about the elements of what will constitute the crime of piracy. First of all, it involves some form of violence, detention of ship or crew, depredation, which is stealing of cargo. That is the first element. It is committed by private people for private end, and it is committed from one ship on another ship, which means that those who perpetrated the crime might have come from a ship or a craft, and that is committed against persons and property on board another ship, and that is outside the territorial sea. So these are the ingredients of the offense of piracy. So it means that when there is piracy or an alleged incidence of piracy, even when property is not stolen, but we can show evidence of violence that is committed, which you may call assault, that itself satisfies one of the ingredients of piracy. Of course, it is always the case that stealing of property is the main aim, but it is possible that in a particular adventure or in a particular action, the pirates might never have property to steal. But in a court of law, if you can establish even the very act of violence against the crew, that satisfies the first element. Then the second element is that it must be committed by private people. This is a historical, if you want, it has a historical reason. Some of the piracy that were committed in historical terms or in history were committed under the patent or were commissioned by kings. Kings had given them the authority to do that. So if you are authorized by a state to go and raid property at sea, then that cannot be considered as an offense of piracy. So because of that historical bit of it, the word committed by private people is still emphasized in international law, and committed from a ship against persons on board another ship. So this distinction again is very vital. It will mean that if you commit piracy, for instance, if you go and raid an offshore platform, for instance, that doesn't satisfy as piracy. It is another form of maritime violence or maritime crime, but not the offense of piracy. We may call it an unlawful activity, an unlawful attack, but strictly speaking, it doesn't fall within the confines of the international law definition of piracy, because that is not from a ship to ship. So the ship to ship requirement is very fundamental in the definition of piracy. And finally, as I said, it must be outside the territorial sea, because piracy is a crime of universal jurisdiction, and for all states to be able to exercise that universal jurisdiction, then the act might have been committed outside the territorial sea. Because if it is committed within the territorial sea, then it falls strictly under the exclusivity of one state's jurisdiction.
So how do you then classify the territorial as you use it in this case? So if a ship were to begin its journey from Ghana, so that ship would be considered a Ghanaian ship, and once it moves out of the Ghanaian territory, then it ceases to be a Ghanaian ship. I don't get it.
You have used very, very important terms. One is the question about a Ghanaian ship. When it comes to the nationality or the description of a ship as either a Ghanaian ship, a Korean ship, an American ship, that is a question of flag, a question of registration. Every ship must register with a country to be able to sail, and that country, let me use the word literally, will then give citizenship or a flag to that ship to fly. Then that ship then become a national of that country. So nationality of a ship is not about your port of sail, it's about the flag, your registration. But coming to the point that you explained, territorial sea is the sea that you measure, if you want, from a base point or the coastline, but it's a bit technical than the coastline, 12 nautical miles into the sea. And 12 nautical miles may be about 18 kilometers into the sea. That space is what we call the territorial sea. Beyond that space is called the high seas. So the point I was explaining and emphasizing is that when it comes to the offense of piracy, because it's an offense of universal jurisdiction, so that every state can exercise jurisdiction, then it must be committed in a sea space where no state has got exclusive jurisdiction. So it must be committed beyond the territorial sea. When it is committed beyond the territorial sea, then you call it piracy. But when the same act is committed within the territorial sea, it is called armed robbery or sea robbery. In that case, the coastal state that is contiguous to that particular coast will then have exclusive jurisdiction, except that the flag may also be able to exercise some kind of jurisdiction. But beyond these two states, and perhaps people that are hurt, their nationals can also exercise jurisdiction. So beyond these 2 or 3 states, then no other state can exercise jurisdiction. But if the same act is then committed just outside the territorial sea, outside the 12 nautical miles, then every state can exercise jurisdiction, and that is strictly speaking piracy. So it is the zone that will distinguish whether you are calling the offense piracy or you are calling it armed robbery at sea.
Wow. And shortly, I would like us to look at the causes. What is it that drives pirates to quote-unquote hijack ships? But before we do that, when you were talking about the elements, one of the key issues you mentioned was the fact that it has to be committed by private people. And again, I'd like us to put the conversation in proper perspective by looking at the dichotomy between what hijacking of a plane, for instance, is from the piracy, hijacking of a ship. What's the main difference? Because I know from the reports that we have as media people, most of the time it is political ambitions that drive people to hijack planes. Yes. But here you are talking about private people before it can be classified as piracy. Yes. How does it work out? Yeah,
very important thing, and this is one of the important elements and debates in the law of piracy. Historically, the word private people, as I emphasized earlier, was used to refer to the fact that the people have not been commissioned by the state. They haven't been commissioned by a king. They haven't received a patent by the king to go out there to commit this act. So in that case, they were considered private people. With time, people are asking the question, when you talk about private people, what about groups that have got some kind of political agitation, and based on that they want to hijack a ship, like we do have in the case of aircraft that are hijacked? Some people take the debate that such actions are not motivated by private aims, that they are motivated by private political motives. But there is a larger group of international lawyers that take the view that that political motive itself is a private motive. It's a group private motive to the extent that it hasn't received the sanction of any sovereign, of any government, then it is a private motive. And based on the historical context, when we use the word private motive, we were actually referring to a situation where that particular conduct is not sanctioned by a state. And this is what distinguished, if you want, the case of the Aquilora. The Aquilora was hijacked in about, I think, 1984-85 by elements of the PLO in Palestine. And they wanted to send a political signal, and they hijacked the ship. So, of course, one of the debates even in that case that didn't make it piracy is because the hijacking was done by people who were already on board the ship. And you remembered I said there must be a ship-to-ship action.
That's right.
So if a crew of a ship hijack a ship, or if people should actually hide inside the ship and hijack a ship, that strictly speaking doesn't fall within the international law definition of piracy. So in the case of the Aquilora, that was one of the points. But the other major point was the whole issue as to whether that was a private action or it was a political action, because the people were claiming to be affiliated to the PLO. But the drift in international law and within experts is that such actions should be deemed as private actions to the extent that they are not actions that are sanctioned by any political authority.
Now, I assume that our viewers do understand what piracy means, but the question is, and so what? For instance, I live in Wa or Tumu or Bogatanga. I don't care what happens in the sea, in Accra and beyond. Why should I be concerned? Must there be an issue that should be of concern to any Ghanaian at all?
Yeah, a very significant issue, because piracy impacts greatly on the global economy. It is one of the major risk factor in global trade. It's a major risk factor in global trade. And let me tell you how that would translate into something that can affect the man that is on the street. When you are talking about piracy, it's a risk. And in every business, risk will have cost implications, because you have to take remedial actions against risk. So, for instance, vessels that are coming into our waters will have to take some kind of insurance. And that insurance is something that is very high in terms of the amount as compared to vessels that are going into areas that are not risk prone in the context of piracy. So that insurance itself will translate into what? Cost. Because the ship owner taking that insurance to cover the ship against piracy will then have to charge a higher freight, and which will mean that the goods that are landing in the shores of Ghana are going to be far costlier than you find the same goods in another region. That is one important element. The other important element is that when there is a risk of piracy, ship owners will have to spend more on equipment, on surveillance, and certain times even on private security. Again, that translates into cost for the consumer. And more importantly, ship owners may have to take very evasive actions. In the case of Somalia, for instance, when ships were trying to avoid piracy, because they wanted to sail off the risk of piracy, they will have to go through a longer route. And that could actually mean that for a trip, a ship might be having an additional cost of fuel and crew payment to an extent of about $300,000 per trip. So you can see, and that again will translate into what? Freight, and it will translate into cost for the consumer in every part of the country, whether you are living by the coast or you are living in Tamale or anywhere else.
And I know you have been doing an extensive study on piracy and issues related to piracy. Can you tell us what your studies have told you about the people involved in such acts? What kind of people are they? Are they people who feel neglected somehow by society? Are they people who have influence but still want to engage in this activity for some other reasons? What are the motivating factors for which people go into such activities?
One of the things that academics and experts do is to analyze crime. And in analyzing crime, especially in the context of piracy, there are certain theoretical postulates. One is, for instance, to say that piracy is driven by social factors, which we call the social factor. And here, there is a classical school and there's a revisionist school. But basically, what all are saying is that there is some form of inequality in society, and because of that inequality in society, it translates into crime. And that is one of the causes of piracy. Somalia and Indonesia may be cited as an example, especially typically in the case of Indonesia. Again, the revisionists will argue that yes, the fundamental problem may be piracy, maybe inequality and social factors, but what then happens is that criminals then feed on that, and then they are able to commit piracy. So you are having a second level of activity on the social problem. So that is the social school making up of the classical and the revisionists. Then you have other understandings of piracy, including piracy as a business activity. If it's a business activity, then it is driven purely by economic motive. People see it as a as a crime that they can benefit from, just like drug trade. There's a lot of money in it, and because there's a lot of money in it, people will go out there to commit it, and there are people that will benefit from the wider environment, and these people may even sponsor the piracy. So in the case of Somalia, we may argue that it started as a social problem, but there's clarity that at some point, or for much part of the time, Somali piracy, for instance, became a business model. Investors across the board, lawyers were part of the Somali piracy gangs, administrators, everybody, people of very high level, and they sponsored the piracy incident. Negotiators, people that have got the expertise, international high-level negotiators were all part of the piracy team. So this time it's no longer a social problem. Right. It is something that has become a business model, and there are people that you can cite or that investigation can show that they build empires out of the piracy situation in Somalia. In the case of the Gulf of Guinea, you may refer to, in some instances, you could use the social theory, but largely, my research points to the fact that yes, social problems might have created a permissive environment for crime and fragility around the region, starting from one enclave largely and then spreading to the larger Gulf of Guinea region. But piracy is motivated by just economic motives. People want to make money out of it, and they are making money out of it.
Doc, you are a lawyer, fortunately for us, and we know that the fact that there's inequality in the world does not justify why anybody should, commit crimes. But others have also argued that it is the lack of strict legal regimes that have, allowed these things to thrive for so long a time. You share the same view?
Yes, the lack of a strict legal regime is one of the fundamental loopholes in the fight against piracy and transnational crime generally. And but generally, when you're talking about transnational crime, especially when you are talking about transnational maritime crime, we must still always remember fundamentally that all criminals that go out there to commit offense at sea, they live on land. And they live on land to sea, and they come back from sea. And they come back from sea back to the land. So one of our fundamental responses should be something that has to do with the land. We should be able to track what is happening on the land. We should be able to have surveillance, intelligence, to be able to know who is going out there at sea and for what purpose. I can give you a fundamental example. Pirates may use fishing vessels, for instance, to commit piracy. If you are very watchful, you may be able to know that that fishing vessel that goes to sea every day didn't bring fish. And if it didn't bring fish, why would people invest, buy fuel with a fishing vessel and go to sea and will not bring fish? So it means that just carefully studying your maritime profile can help you combat the offense of piracy. Then there's a response tools at sea, that is patrols, surveillance, detection, arresting, and policing the maritime environment. Then we come to what you mentioned, which is a very fundamental thing that has to do with the legal framework. The legal framework must be robust in such a way that the investigation process can be something that will be able to bring out the necessary elements, and then there must be a system to be able to try the people within that particular country, which means that there must be legal framework in the form of the criminalization of the offense in that particular country.
Already we have talked about the effects of the activities of pirates on the global economy, but again I want us to simplify it. So if I have a brother in the US or UK or anywhere else around the world who has sent me some gift items and it's on the high seas, as we speak today, do I stand the risk of not receiving those items, probably because of the activities of pirates?
That could happen depending on the particular region that you are talking about and the particular cargo. Although generally in the Gulf of Guinea, that is in the west coast of Africa, piracy is the motivation of piracy is on oil cargo, but there has also been instances where other cargo has been stolen. So that is something that you can expect, that it can impact on the goods that you are expecting from abroad, because that may be stolen. But even if it is not stolen, there can be other risk related factors. But the truth is that in the case of the context of the Gulf of Guinea, largely pirates are targeting oil tankers. And that is another important element then. To the extent that oil is very important for the security of many nations, economic and social security of nations, then you then understand that piracy will also have another impact.
Beyond the Gulf of Guinea, how widespread is this phenomenon?
In terms of numbers, actually, Indonesia or the waters in Southeast Asia still surpasses the Gulf of Guinea. The number of piracy there actually higher than Gulf of Guinea. And here, when I'm talking about piracy, I'm actually using the term to refer to both attacks within territorial sea and outside territorial sea, because in the case of Indonesia, most of the attacks are actually within the territorial sea, but I'm using the word piracy referring to piratical attacks, all the attacks collectively. So in the case of globally, Indonesia still represents higher number of attacks, and it used to then be Somalia. Although we heard so much about Somalia, Indonesia recorded more incidents than Somalia. But the reason is that the nature of the attacks were always very violent, and the type of ships that are attacked in Somali context were also very special. So when it comes to the Gulf of Guinea, now that there's a decline in the attacks, substantial decline in Somali waters, Gulf of Guinea is actually second in terms of the number of attacks. But in the context of the seriousness of the attacks, Gulf of Guinea seems to be leading globally now.
Yeah, I'd like us to look at the Gulf of Guinea, because we've used it in abstract terms. But really, if we want to break it down for the layman out there, what's the scope of the Gulf of Guinea?
Yeah, and it is very important that you have asked this question, because that term itself will not admit of one definition. There are different connotations when it comes to a definition of the Gulf of Guinea. I can just mention, for instance, 2 or 3. If you ask mariners, like captains of ships, what is the Gulf of Guinea? They will tell you the Gulf of Guinea is that Gulf. It's just that Gulf. And here, they'll be referring to that maritime space from about Cameroon to Cote d'Ivoire. That is where they will say this is the Gulf of Guinea, because they are referring to the Gulf, you know, that particular curvature is what they are referring to as the Gulf of Guinea from a mariner's point of view. Then you have had other definitions of the Gulf of Guinea. For instance, the International Oceanographic Organization defined the Gulf of Guinea as from Cape Verde to Gabon. In fact, from Liberia, to Gabon, and not even the whole of Liberia, from Cape Lopez in Liberia to Cape Palmas in Liberia to Cape Lopez in Gabon. So this is the IHO definition of the Gulf of Guinea. But the term now seems to have acquired a different meaning altogether. And when we are using the term in this context, we are referring to this new dimension or definition of the Gulf of Guinea. When we talk about the Gulf of Guinea now, we are generally talking about the whole of the west coast of Africa. And this definition, if you want, is something that you can find in 2 United Nations Security Council resolutions. The UN adopted, the UN Security Council adopted a resolution 2018 in 2011, where they use the Gulf of Guinea to refer to member states of ECOWAS and ECAS. ECOWAS and ECAS. Right. And then they repeated the same wording in another resolution in 2012, resolution 2036, where again they use the term Gulf of Guinea to refer to member states of ECOWAS and ECAS. So if we are keeping in tune with that particular trend, then when we're talking about the Gulf of Guinea now, we are talking about the member states of these 2 regional organizations. In that case, in terms of physical space, you are talking about from Cape Verde to Angola. But this is then where we have a problem, because in that case, you are defining a maritime space from the point of view of regionalism. You are using regional organizations to define what? A maritime space. And when you do that, you then run into a situation as we have it now, where Burundi is seen as a member of the Gulf of Guinea. Because Burundi is a member of ECAS, the Economic Community of Central African States. But if you look at it, Burundi, although a landlocked state, actually, its maritime imperatives doesn't lie on the west coast of Africa, which means its maritime interest. Its maritime interest is in the east coast of Africa. But when member states of Gulf of Guinea went to adopt the Code of Conduct against piracy, Burundi was one of the signatories. Ironically, Mauritania is not a member, because Mauritania left, if you want, ECOWAS, as you will be aware, in about 2000, and joined the Maghreb Union. So because of this, because of this situation where Mauritania is no longer a member of ECOWAS, then Mauritania is not a signatory to that particular.
Wow, it looks like issues within the maritime industry are very complicated. Is it not possible for experts like you to meet and come up with conventional definitions for all these terms, Gulf of Guinea, so that when lay people like us chance on your documents and we read them, we'll be able to understand, and if we see any suspicious movements, then we can report? Is it not possible to come up with conventional definitions instead of these regional definition and captain's definitions and so on and so forth?
Yeah, very well. So I think, though, that in the context of what we're having now, especially because of the adoption of the Yaoundé Code of Conduct, and because of what is happening between within ECOWAS and ECAS, I think largely we can now stick to the fact that globally that the member states of ECOWAS and ECAS constitute the Gulf of Guinea. It just leaves us with that anomaly where Mauritania is not a member and then Burundi is a member.
Wow.
And like all things, you always have something to deal with. That is a bit not right in the context.
Let's come closer home. And again, when you were giving us the definition of the territorial boundaries, did you say 18 nautical miles? Was
12 nautical miles.
Nautical miles.
Yes.
Beyond that, you define it as the high seas.
Yes.
Now,
I define it as the high seas, or in legal terms, although for practical purpose, that's what we may call the exclusive economic zone.
Exclusive economic zone, meaning no man's land?
No, what it means is that it is that country, that is the coastal state, that is contiguous to that area beyond the 12 nautical mile, that has got exclusive economic interest. It means that Ghana as a coastal state has got exclusive economic interest starting from the 12 nautical mile to the 200th nautical mile. So we have got exclusive economic interest, but we haven't got sovereignty, but exclusive economic interest. So unlike the territorial sea where we have sovereignty, and because of that, you realize that Article 4 of our Constitution defines the territories of Ghana to be the 10 regions of Ghana, including the territorial sea, which means the sea is conceptually part of the possession of Ghana or the sovereignty of Ghana. But beyond that, we have the exclusive economic zone. There we don't have sovereignty. We have what we call sovereign rights, or what you may call economic exclusive rights.
Wow.
And that right is what translates into fisheries rights, for instance. Our right to have the jubilee fields there, because the oil is from the seabed of that particular area. So without that regime that gave us that exclusivity of economic interest, then we could not say that jubilee fields belong to us. But it's because of that international law regime that has given us that exclusive economic interest.
Maybe one day we should have a full show on this boundary debate between Ghana and La Côte d'Ivoire, because from a layman's point of view, you look at that line and it's as if it's bending towards the boundary of La Côte d'Ivoire, but that's a debate for another day. But let's come back to the issue. So recently in the news, there's piracy in Ghana. We have arrested some pirates and they are under interrogation right now. What's the story?
The story is largely what we've been going through in the last few days. That the pirates were arrested somewhere outside the territorial sea of Ghana, but within our exclusive economic zone. That is about 25 nautical miles off Tema. That is where the pirates were arrested. But they were arrested by the Ghana Navy, and the pirates are alleged to have actually hijacked a ship from possibly within the territorial sea of Nigeria and sailed the ship all the way, you know, into our waters or somewhere across the Gulf of Guinea. In fact, the ship actually had been hijacked for a number of days. For more than 3-4 days, it had been hijacked. But the Ghana Navy, as part of its maritime rule, and being aware and receiving the intelligence that such a ship has been hijacked, then deployed at sea, patrolled the sea in search of the vessel. Of course, other nations would have been doing that, but the Ghana Navy was able to intercept and arrest the vessel, and the crew and the pirates were then taken and brought on land. So
the reality is here, it's coming closer. So what is the international community doing to, you know, combat this crime?
Yes, and the reality is coming closer because you also remember that actually last year we had 3 related piracy incidents either within the waters of Ghana or very close in the waters of Ghana, about June, July last year.
Right.
So that is the reality. And even when the reality is not so close, certain times we don't realize it. You remember we had a problem with the West African gas pipeline. It was actually as a result of a piracy incident, not in our waters, but in Togolese waters. In this case, the vessel was being chased by pirates when it was anchored, and it wanted to take off, and it didn't lift the anchor. So it continued to move while trying to lift the anchor, and it ran into the gas pipeline and broke the gas pipeline. And you remember how we suffered the consequences for over a year, and we are still actually suffering the consequences. So it's a maritime crime that can have different dimensions of implication, and it is one that the global community has taken very seriously. And the fact that I'm referring to 2 Security Council resolutions, because imagine Security Council, normally when we hear of Security Council, we are talking about them ordering either an embargo or a sanction against a country. And if Security Council should actually also adopt a resolution regarding piracy in the Gulf of Guinea on 2 occasions, then that means that it is something that is of concern to the international community, and something that the international community is well focused on.
Right, and if you just joined us, we're having a conversation with Dr. Ali Kamal Deen. He's an international maritime law expert. He's also Director of Research and a lecturer at the Ghana Armed Forces Staff College. We have been looking at maritime piracy, and we are asking, is it a threat to global security and economy? We will take a very short break. When we return, I'll ask Doctor, now this arrest that has been effected, does it mean Ghana is ready to combat this crime on its own, should it happen in our territorial waters? This question when we return from the break. Please don't go away. Right, welcome back. We are having a conversation around maritime security, and we are asking if piracy is a threat to global security and the economy. And with us in the studio is Dr. Ali Kamal Deen, international maritime law expert. He's director of research and lecturer at the Ghana Armed Forces Staff College. Doc, thank you very much. Well, just before we went for the break, I wanted to find out, now that Ghana has been able to arrest pirates, does that indicate our preparedness to combat this crime on our own?
You can never exclusively combat piracy as a single country. And I'll come to that. And that is why we have such initiatives as those being taken by the Gulf of Guinea countries collectively, and also what is encouraged by the Security Council. But clearly, the Ghana Navy has shown that it is able to perform the job, that it is able to keep our maritime space very safe. You would realize from the news that last year the Ghana Navy was declared as the most successful and most effective navy across the west coast of Africa. So, the west coast. So that is a very important achievement for the Ghana Navy. And the Ghana Navy has also demonstrated through even outside piracy, through drug arrest, and last year, in the case of a number of vessels that were pirated, the Ghana Navy was able to intercept some of those vessels. Yes, but at the end of the day, and in this particular action, look, you have to give credit to the Ghana Navy, because it is only on very few occasions that you can arrest pirates at sea. I can tell you on authority that there is a very risky venture to try to arrest pirates. The Nigerian Navy, a very strong navy, has lost not less than 100 ratings and officers put together for the last 5 years.
Wow.
in their combat against piracy. They've lost them fire to fire at sea, and then they lost them. So it is an act that you must commend the particular ship, and then the Ghana Navy entirely, and then also the country for being able to achieve this much. But when you are talking about combating piracy, you require global cooperation, and you require regional cooperation. And what I refer to, the code of conduct for the repression of piracy in the Gulf of Guinea, is one of the means that Gulf of Guinea countries are trying to tackle piracy. It will involve information exchange, it will involve intelligence sharing, it will involve communication and joint surveillance, maybe patrols together, and issues such as repatriation and extradition. So that is the kind of framework that you are talking about. And globally too, there are a lot of global initiatives, and the International Maritime Organization and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, because piracy is a transnational crime, and it is always linked actually with other crimes when you study it very carefully. It can be linked to fisheries crime, or it may be linked to drug trade. So again, it is something that the UNOCD is talking about. And then you then have, even within the continent, AU, and then you have ECOWAS also dealing with it. So you require very high level of regional cooperation, and Interpol also plays a very important role in studying this particular offense and in piecing together various offices to be able to combat the crime.
So we require a very high level of cooperation. How would you assess the level of cooperation that we have currently
in the region?
Yes.
It's one perhaps that is just about the average. It's one that is on the average, partly because there was so much focus on Somalia, and the international community invested a lot of time and effort in Somalia, but that should have prompted us that Somalia was just one of the things in the chain. So we should have been looking at other regions. And although the sound was already showing, the signs were showing, and the sound was also already becoming louder from 2005, the international community continued to look into Somalia, because the Somali piracy is of great concern, but also because of the dynamics of the two maritime environments. Of course, the maritime space of Somalia is different from Ghana. It is from the Gulf of Guinea. It is one that is far more strategic in terms of trade than the Gulf of Guinea. But when you put together three elements, fisheries, trade, and then oil and gas activities, then the Gulf of Guinea also becomes very strategic. But this over-investment and over-focus on Somalia means that in the case of the Gulf of Guinea, we are now beginning to build the mechanisms and the structures to be able to tackle piracy.
You know, just as we were about to start jubilating because we had arrested pirates, it appears there's another problem with the prosecution. What are the legal problems we are likely to face in prosecuting these people?
It's a question about the definition of piracy or the criminalization of piracy in our law. In criminal law, you must be able to point to a statute under which you are trying somebody. The fact that something is bad, is wrong, even if it has been criminalized by every other state in the world, but not by your state, you find it very difficult to try the person. It is also true that piracy is a crime of universal jurisdiction, which means that any state can try. But for a country, you must be able to then translate that into your normal legal framework, which means that we must have piracy being criminalized in our law, clearly, and then you can then arrest and try people for the offense of piracy. The problem we have is that our legal framework for piracy is outdated. It's actually, and it satisfies the historical context of piracy,
right,
where people went to sea without being commissioned, without being authorized, where another person that has been entrusted with goods will actually sail and go and sell the goods. But this classical definition of piracy, which is where we are now, and which is actually reflected in the Law of the Sea Convention, and which is actually also borne out by customary international law, has not been reflected in our legal provisions. So if we take our Criminal Offences Act, and on the basis of that you want to try this offense of piracy, then you cannot do that. But if the arrest had been within our territorial waters, then you didn't need to go through that legal difficulty, because you could just try the people for the offense of armed robbery.
Wow. So are they likely to go scot-free? For the difficulties that you have enumerated,
I think there are also other reasons, actually, perhaps why also, even if we had the legal framework to try them, we could perhaps still cede jurisdiction to another state. Because if the vessel was actually hijacked in Nigerian waters, Nigeria may have much interest in trying to follow the crime, because look, you are just not dealing with these 4 people or 6 or 7, 8 people that has been arrested. You are dealing with a whole number of connections, and it's a transnational crime networks. So Nigeria may have larger people to deal with in terms of the crime that has been committed. But if they are also even, for example, nationals of Nigeria, then that has been raised to a higher bar. So at the end of the day, even if we had the legal framework, of course we could try, and trying could actually mean that we are demonstrating as a country that we are not only there going out there to hunt for pirates, but when we find them, we'll try and convict them. But it is also possible that we could, through some form of bilateral arrangement, hand them over to Nigeria. And it is possible, though I cannot say conclusively, that in this case that might be what may happen.
And my penultimate question will come direct from my producer, and I'm going to read this because he is very particular about it. He says, how enormous would you say a state as the financial and other cost of rerouting of ships from Paris-infested waters to their respective destinations?
Yeah, that is very enormous. That is very enormous. And in areas of open seas, like in the case of the Indian Ocean, as I alluded to earlier, depending on the particular trip, the total cost of rerouting could be over $300,000, because you are having extra cost of fuel, spending more time, because it could increase your voyage by, say, another 5-6 days. So you have to pay crew more. You have to extend your insurance cover more. So when you take all this into consideration, it can be very high. It could be up to about $300,000 in the case of open seas, like in the Indian Ocean. In the case of the Gulf of Guinea, it's a bit tricky, because in reality, actually, most of the vessels that come into the Gulf of Guinea, a large number of them are actually calling in the ports of the Gulf of Guinea. So it's much like they will have to live by this risk. So here, the cost actually will not be in the form of rerouting. It will be in the form of extra measures that are being taken, like surveillance and then what we call anti-piracy equipments like hot water hose and other things that you have to put on board the ship, which cost a lot of money, and then also the insurance cost. So depending on the particular maritime space, what will constitute or trigger the cost will be different. And this is the distinction that I've just explained. But at the end of the day, it is something that will impact on the overall cost of maritime transportation, and for that matter, will translate into higher cost of goods and services, possibly for the consumer.
Wow. Doc, my very final question would be, so what should we as ordinary citizens who know nothing about piracy and maritime laws, what should we do to identify problems such as piracy? And if we are even able to identify any problems, what steps should we take?
Ordinary people can play a significant role in the whole combat of piracy. For example, I believe that by ordinary people, you're referring to also, for example, to the fishing community.
Exactly.
The fishing community spend a lot of time at sea, and because they spend a lot of time at sea, they tend to even understand the sea better certain times than navies. So when they see people that don't belong there, that are there at sea, having some kind of illegal motive, they are able to know. So such kind of information sharing can be very important. But also, they leave the coast to the sea. And when they leave the coast to the sea, it means that coastal communities can also play a role certain times in identifying people that have certain particular motives, like piratical motives, and going out there at sea to commit crime. So these are some of the ways that very ordinary people, but understanding the crime itself is extremely important, that this is a crime that can impact on you. And of course, it may also be that you can play a role in advocacy, in pushing the various institutions that are supposed to play their role. That is in the context of civil society and the larger population.
Oh, all right. And someone says maritime lawyers are very unique, you know. Trust us. Good show. Allow us to participate too. Okay. I'm here to find out who sent in that one. But we have our Facebook page open there. You can send in all your comments on Facebook. We'll get them through to Doctor, and if he has any responses, we'll get them to you. Doc, we'd like to thank you so very much for coming to educate us on this very important topic, and we hope that next time when we invite you, hopefully on similar issues, but maybe I would particularly like us to look at the maritime boundary issue concerning maritime boundaries and how we can draw the line between where ours end and where another's begins. But on this occasion, I'd like to thank you once again for coming. We have been educated, and we hope that next time we invite you, you'll be available, sir.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, and for inviting me to share my thoughts, and I'm grateful.
Thank you so very much. We've been speaking to Dr. Ali Kamal Deen, who is an international maritime law expert. He is also Director of Research and lecturer at the Ghana Armed Forces Staff College. We have been looking at maritime piracy, a threat to global security and the global economy. We'll be here again tomorrow, God willing, inshallah, with another very important issue. Join us then. But until then, you enjoy the rest of our programs, and see you. Good night.